Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet, most notably from theathletic.com. He is useful human Arif Hassan. Arif, I can't imagine what we have to talk about today.
There's, nothing significant in the Vikings universe. The Senior Bowl is not for a couple of weeks, so we should have scheduled a draft guest, honestly.
Or we could have talked about, we could have got a Cowboys guest on, and maybe Justice on to talk about the Mike McCarthy hiring for Dallas.
In Dallas, yeah. Talk about flats all day.
The thing that really gets me about that is that there's all this news that he spent a bunch of time with PFF trying to add analytics to his game, and I think there was a tweet out from PFF that said if he wins, we're taking all the credit, but if not,
I've never heard of this man in my life.
Nope, not a clue. Well, welcome to this episode of Norse Code. We will be going over the victory over the Saints. And a lot of aspects of it, including a few things that aren't getting a lot of attention that we feel really should. But before we begin, just want to thank you guys so much for listening. If you hear value in the content that we provide, you can help the show in a couple of different ways. You can post links to it on social media, share it with your friends, or if you'd like to give money to the cause, you can go to patreon.com/NorseCode, or you can go to paypal.me/NorseCode as well. Patreon people will be receiving a special gift from me in the next day or so. That will be the new clip show. Also, people who sent in for the Tree Fitty gifts will also be receiving their stuff this week as well. So just want to knock that out quick before we actually start the show, because this is going to be a long show, so settle in. This is going to be a good one. The Vikings win in New Orleans, and boy, that seemed like the opposite of most Vikings games, starting from the beginning when the Vikings decided to receive instead of defer.
Pretty bizarre. I think a lot of people have been kind of asking for the Vikings to do that. My stance is that it's probably better for the Vikings to do it. It ultimately doesn't matter that much, because the extra possession you get. So the point of deferring, which is what coaches typically do nowadays, is to get that extra possession in the middle, and to basically gain tempo. But the problem is that you lose the first possession. Like, that's the whole point of switching sides. So, I don't think there's any additional advantage, because you're playing catch up, from a possession standpoint. If you defer and then you just make up for it. So you're actually behind tempo and then you make up for it. So I don't love it. So getting the first possession and being able to control the tempo of a game a little bit earlier, I think that's a little bit better. Again, it doesn't matter that much, but it was kind of interesting to see the Vikings do that. I think they oriented their entire strategy around keeping Drew Brees off the field, which again, I don't think is all that interesting, because it's a possessions game, not a time of possessions game. But it's kind of the same either way, because if you can reduce the number of possessions, you can reduce the opportunities that Brees can prove that he's a better quarterback than Cousins I think over 40 possessions, Brees probably beats Cousins, but over 10 possessions, a lot of things can happen, which is kind of exactly what happened in this game. So I liked it. The Vikings, they wasted that first possession.
Yeah, it turned into
I thought was sound enough.
It turned into a wonderful theory of trying to control the narrative and take control of things. And then there's a Thielen fumble, and that's pretty rare in and of itself. And that was what I think one of the few
unless
penalties.
He's playing the Saints.
Well, yeah,
right?
that was one of the few penalties that wasn't called back.
That's right. Yeah. Pretty interesting. And it was obviously kind of the start to this weird narrative arc that Thielen himself had over the course of the game. So I teased a hot take that I ultimately, after discussing it with a couple of other people, don't believe, but it is an interesting discussion given the significant value of turnovers, like how big they are. And the adjusted net yards per attempt calculation puts it at about 45 yards is the equivalent. So, you're basically even if you gain 45 yards and then give up the football. So Thielen ends up with 129 yards in the game, but like 86 in regulation, right? So 86 in regulation. If he loses 45 yards of credit because of that fumble, plus we say, hey, you lose a couple of yards because of the opportunity cost of the drop in the second quarter. Boy, that's a 30, or I guess a 41 yard plus, maybe it's like 38 or 37 because of the opportunity cost. So if he does about 37 yards of value in regulation, did he hurt the Vikings more than he helped? It's an absurd thing to say, right? Because like he had a deep catch late in the fourth quarter, then he also had the 43-yarder in overtime. And so the net result of his play over the course of the whole game, which includes overtime, is positive. But do the Vikings win in regulation without Thielen? Because that fumble is huge, that drop is big. And I was kind of wrestling with, I did not want to put this take out on the timeline, especially after it became the hero of one of the most emotional games that we've seen, at least in the past 2 years, right? I didn't want to be like, hey, so the hero, that guy sucks, right? I didn't want to put it on the timeline, right? Especially because, with my like stance that Diggs is a better receiver than Thielen, it might just seem like I'm just, crapping on Thielen for whatever. But, to the point about Diggs, I've said that Diggs, despite posting a lot of traditional statistics that put him in the top 3 of all receivers in the NFL, is actually maybe closer to top 10 because of the fumbles and stuff like that. So, and the interceptions that he's caused. So I think it's an interesting discussion. The reason you don't tweet it is because it's not a discussion that can be made interesting on Twitter. And it's a difficult one to argue. So Thielen ends up with 7 first downs, I think, on 7 catches or something like that. And that's difficult value to replicate. But what yardage is there if Thielen is not? Because Diggs was, I think, egregiously under targeted in this game. Obviously, Diggs agrees. Which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later in this podcast, but Diggs gets more targets if Thielen isn't there, right? And I mean, we don't know that for a fact. I mean, there have been some games where you're like, hey, he doesn't have receivers. Why is he throwing a CJ Ham? But, from my view in the press box and my quick look at the All-22, I haven't done a ton of review on the All-22 because I'm already on to the 49ers game, short week, right? Diggs was really ridiculously open for a lot of the game. And so can Diggs generate 39 additional yards of value or whatever, 35, 36, 39 yards of additional value, without Thielen on the field? And I think so. I think he gets enough targets to overcome that. The practical effect of this fumble is that it takes points away from the Vikings who, let's say they kick a field goal on the drive. We don't want to be too optimistic about their chances on the drive without that fumble. So let's say they kick a field goal. The Saints in return kick a field goal, and that was actually pretty astonishing. The Vikings defense did a great job. The Saints, when they gained possession off the Thielen fumble, the expected points was 4.71. And so the Vikings being able to hold them to a field goal was pretty extraordinary. So field goal, that's a 6-point swing. Which, by the way, that's how much the Vikings won by. But because it went into overtime, that calculation is a little weird. So if it's a 6-point swing, then did Thielen make up for it with 6 additional points of value over regulation? Obviously, I think in overtime, there's no question that when you include overtime, Thielen was clearly a net positive. But does he provide additional value in regulation over that? And I don't know. I was argued out of it, and I think the arguments were pretty compelling because generally these numbers don't take into account the value of a first down and stuff like that. And his ability to generate first downs, I don't think is super easily replicable. Plus, Diggs' value in part in this game was his ability to help Thielen get open. In fact, that 43-yard pass in overtime is the perfect example of it. Ted Wynn tweeted out a really great video. Ted Wynn of The Athletic, I always want to plug The Athletic, right? Ted Wynn tweeted out a video that indicated that because the safety was turning towards Diggs on the deep throw, so Diggs is running a corner post and Thielen is running post corner, essentially. So they're both moving in the same directions at the same time. Plus, you've got a dig underneath if it ends up being kind of single high to draw the safety in. That safety doesn't get drawn in on the dig, but he does look towards Diggs's route. And because of that, because of the safety turn, Cousins is able to choose his target and he chooses Thielen 43 yards. A couple plays later, it's a touchdown. So obviously part of Diggs's value is his ability to create yards for other people that doesn't exist if those other people aren't there. And conversely, some of the value that Thielen provides, obviously, is to provide, space for Diggs. And I assume on the slant that Diggs caught on third down, in overtime, I think it was overtime. In overtime, I assume part of that has to do with the way the coverage shifted because of Thielen. So, it's difficult, obviously, to extricate, all of this. But it is difficult to produce as many first downs as Thielen did. So I don't know that it's all replaceable, but, I just think it's an interesting discussion that, it's impossible to have. So I really wanted to put on the timeline. I know Doggedy Crane was mad at me for never putting it out, but if you listen to the podcast, which I know you do, here it is. You finally got to hear the spicy hot take.
Well, we're also kind of punishing him because he didn't end up winning the Norse Code Fantasy League, which meant that neither of the three of us ended up winning.
Yeah, we'll have to be content with our phenomenal record of making it to the finals.
Yes.
But it's unfortunate that he had to lose it for us.
It really is. We shouldn't have put him in that sort of position. It's
really, yeah,
too bad. But so the Vikings only allowed 3 points on the short field, and there was a huge sack to end that drive.
Yeah, that was. I think they both beat their tackles, right? Yes. Everson Griffin and Danielle Hunter. Hunter, I think, wins faster, which I think is kind of fascinating because Ryan Ramczyk has been a better right tackle and Tron Armstead a left tackle. On the other hand, I think Tron Armstead is the better player, and that ends up. I mean, Danielle Hunter, his sacks in this game, his pressures in this game were incredible, but his sacks could not have come at like better times. Like if you could choose when he gets sacks in this game, I don't know that you would choose two different moments, right? Like one to prevent the impact of a turnover. If you believe in momentum, you kind of want to get that out of the way early, and then one late to prevent that late score. Just really incredible. Interesting statistic that, or not interesting statistic, more interesting framing of the statistic that I tweeted out. I ended up putting in my article, covering The Athletic, or for The Athletic covering the game, which by the way, I think this is like my best post-game piece I've written, at least since the Bears game, but maybe ever, right? So please check it out. I'm super proud of it. This game was Zimmer's magnum opus. That piece, maybe not my magnum opus, but it pretty good. It's not quite as good as Zimmer's coaching in this game, but it did all right. So Ryan Ramczyk had 1,058 snaps this season. 1,058. Doesn't allow a sack in any of those snaps. In 49 snaps against Danielle Hunter, he allows 2. That's incredible. This one obviously stopped the Saints from turning that turnover into 7 points, putting the Vikings into a much deeper hole. It probably would have changed how the end of the half goes, which also that complicates like the Thielen argument, right? Because if the score changes, then the teams play differently and stuff like that. But it significantly alters the way the Vikings have to or get to call plays. The Vikings aren't forced to press early on. I think it's pretty big. Even if you don't like believe in momentum and stuff like that, that's like a 4-point play. So, really phenomenal. This one was kind of interesting because I think a lot of the focus on the way that Zimmer ended up playing defense or designing the defense for this game ended up being on the interesting weirdness of Sendeo in the slot. And then also the 2 inside pass rushers, Everson Griffin and Danielle Hunter on passing downs, with your 2 defensive ends on the outside. That ended up being a focus of the game, but this sack came, actually both of Danielle Hunter's sack came when he was on the edge. And so, at least, the second sack, I'm pretty confident. Yeah, he was on the edge and then he dips inside. So it looks like he's rushing inside. And so, he just wins with extraordinary speed and pretty good technique. And then Griffin kind of being there, I think forces Brees, to begin scrambling, and he's just not going to win a foot race against those two. So, hugely important. And while I would not argue that this was the point in the game that you could say, hey, maybe they can make something of it, I think it kind of stabilized expectations because, at least for fans, right? Because you're not getting your doors blown off at the beginning.
Yeah. Seeing 0 to 7 to start the game is less than ideal. That would definitely be one of those like, oh, well, this is exactly what we expected this whole week. Lovely. I'm going to go drink some bleach. We might as well talk about the decision to put the outside rushers on the inside now, because this was right around the time that it started getting picked up that this is what the Vikings were doing. And as it turns out, this was something that the Falcons did very successfully against against Brees and the Saints. And it worked. It worked incredibly well.
Yeah. So this reminds me of, I originally gave it to the 2007 Giants, but it's actually the 2011 Giants, the Perry Fuel defense, not the Steve Spagnuolo defense. Which, by the way, 2011, the Super Bowl winning team is running the Tampa 2 defense. Man, people were really down on the Tampa 2 defense even then. And it, won the Super Bowl that year. Mind you, as underdogs. I don't want to overdo it, but yeah.
Nonsense. It was Eli Manning's fantastic play. Hall of Famer. Right.
But yeah. You had I think it was Jason Pierre-Paul and Osi Umenyiora and Justin Tuck and Matthias Kiwanuka is the fourth guy that happened to be there. I think that was pretty great. So I was listening to Eric Eager's podcast, the PFF Forecast. They have kind of an instant reaction show to all the wild card games. And I was so deeply uninterested in the other AFC game, the one that wasn't Tennessee Patriots, that I had to re-listen to that bit 8 times because I was like, what is he talking about?
the Bills game, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's who. Yeah,
Bills Texans.
I couldn't even remember the teams playing, and there's 8 teams. Come on.
I'll never forget it just because of the lateral, which we will discuss later.
But yeah, so it took me a while to get to the part where they ended up talking about the Vikings, and I was like, I wonder if he's going to talk about coverage versus pass rush, because if you take a look at the All-22, which he doesn't have access to because it's an immediate reaction. But if you take a look at the All-22 and some of the replays that were pretty good, the coverage was not as good as the pass rush. And Brees was held to under 4.5 yards per attempt in the first 3 quarters of the game, right? So does he? I mean, this guy is the king of coverage is more important than pass rush. But obviously, he is talking about our ability to predict games, our ability to determine what's more likely to happen if you pull a player out and stuff like that. But it is not necessarily 100% descriptive in every game where a defense plays well. So I was kind of curious what he was going to say, and he basically just said, "Yeah, I think the pass rush was more important than the coverage in this game." And I was like, well, okay, great. I'm not crazy. It certainly seemed like the case. I said that on the Athletic podcast immediately after the show, that I thought, the pass rush was more important than the coverage in this game. And then you take a look at the coverage, and Vikings defenders are kind of out of place on a somewhat alarming number of plays, and it kind of didn't matter. And a big part of that pass rush helping was that interior pass rush on long third downs. Eager brings up the point that because Brees is a shorter quarterback, but he doesn't have the speed of a Kyler Murray or Russell Wilson, that interior pressure is going to affect him a little bit more. because, it's difficult to see over these giant behemoths, barreling at you. And so he can't step up in the pocket, obviously, and so he can't step out. Interior pressure typically is a lot less valuable than edge pressure, but against Brees in particular, it might actually just be more valuable because, he doesn't have the ability to see over the line. So, in that case, and obviously, the biggest part of this matchup is that the Saints have two, Pro Bowl / All Pro tackles and, two guards that are like whatever, right? And so that was a big part of it. But part of it might just be that Brees kind of holds on to it. After the game, Daniel Hunter said, we knew that he was going to, hold on to it a little bit, if we gave him interior pressure. And then they also said that they watched the Falcons game where the Falcons, beat them, I think 26-9, to look for clues. And it was interior pressure in that game that cost it. And the Falcons actually didn't line up their, edge rushers on the inside. They just happened to have a guy named Grady Jarrett that's pretty good. And so they were able to create a bunch of interior pressure. I think Grady Jarrett ends up with 3 sacks in that game. And so the Vikings were like, well, we don't have a Grady Jarrett, but we have 4 defensive ends, and all of them are pretty strong. Like, we know that the Vikings draft super athletes at defensive end, and so they're all pretty fast, but they're also all pretty strong. And so they have the ability to take on guards, especially in pass pro, where the strength matters a little bit less. And so, that forced Brees to be uncomfortable. He held onto the ball longer than I think, we've seen all year. And so, yeah, he's thrown away, passes where there's definitely receivers open on third down and stuff like that. He can't get to his hot reads because those passes might be batted down or even intercepted by Griffin or Hunter. Griffin is using like his normal array of pass rush moves too. Like, he's not changing his approach because he's got space on the edge. He's doing like his spin move and stuff like that. And he's got just such an incredible spin move. And now that, Jared Allen and Dwight Freeney are, out of the league, he might have the best spin move. And DeMarcus Ware, he might have the best spin move, in the NFL at this moment. So, he's running the spin move on like poor Andrus Peat, and he's creating a ton of space. He's running, into the tackle essentially, to create space for the spin move as he spins back inside between the center and the guard. And Pete is just trying to gain depth, and he's running into his own tackle, and it is just beautiful. And yeah, they were able to generate a fair amount of pressure on third down. And so the Saints, I think they're, in the first 3 quarters, they're like 2 for 9 on third down. I think they go 2 for 2 in the fourth quarter. So, again, fourth quarter was just totally different for them. But, that ends up meaning that they're like 4 of 11 on third down for the game. So, pretty incredible stuff that allowed the Vikings to force the Saints off the field. They don't score any points on a lot of these drives. And yeah, it was nice that Zimmer took inspiration from, or maybe he just decided to do it himself. And it's just, sometimes the best defenses just kind of reproduce themselves organically. But yeah, it was nice to see kind of the throwback to the NASCAR package that the Giants ran in 2011. Because, it was super effective. I don't know if we'll continue to see it just because it was clear that the landscape of the matchup, kind of defined this approach. But, I would be surprised if they didn't try it at least 1 or 2 more times this year again. Or at least against the 49ers. So yeah, I thought that was brilliant. That was, I think, a big part of Zimmer's, phenomenal game planning for this matchup.
So let's move on to the next drive, and can we all agree as Vikings fans that if we ever see Diggs drop back as a quarterback one more time, we're just going to turn off the game? Like, I can't, it's just so frustrating to watch. And they've tried that play at least 3 times this year, and every time it has died an immediate death.
It'll work one day, James.
No! It won't. It will never work. And the problem is that Diggs isn't in a position where he thinks that he can throw it away, because Diggs believes, I wouldn't say rightly so, but Diggs believes he's Superman.
With reason. With reason. Diggs believes with reason.
Yeah. Diggs truly believes in himself and doesn't believe in throwing the ball away. Instead, he's just going to eat a sack, which is just a dumb thing to say, but Diggs is going to find himself on his back yet again, 5 to 10 yards past the line, or behind the line of scrimmage.
So, I think my favorite part about this is that 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, they did it, and it was perfectly set up. Diggs has a clean pocket. The defense is screwed up and all out of place. Kirk Cousins is like wide open, like 8 yards downfield, not like, he's like 40 yards downfield or anything like that. And Diggs just like overthrows him. And you're like, well, that's the situation. That's ideal. And it didn't work. Like everything went right except the plan. Like the thing that you planned for didn't work. So that's interesting. I know Thielen has a hell of an arm. I'm shocked that they didn't actually do that for Thielen. Because seeing him throw it around, I would imagine he's got a quicker release than Diggs. Not that release time matters for wide receivers because they all take forever.
I want to see the stat on that. I want to see
that would be amazing.
Diggs' release time versus Thielen. Diggs might be the better receiver. Thielen might be the better quarterback.
I think he might be, but I don't know. It doesn't matter. We should not have to find out. Is the real point here. But yeah, probably scrap that one. And the thing is, I think that this was like a brilliant called game, both offensively and defensively. But like, I don't think anyone who was like, this was a terribly executed offensive game plan or a terribly called offensive game plan. I don't think anyone who says that has like no reason to believe that. Yeah. I think it was brilliant. I think that there's definitely reasons to go 180 on that and say it was stupid. And that's like one of I'm not going to defend that one. Don't do it.
You can still be a genius and a dumbass at the exact same time. And at that particular
Bill Belichick blows draft picks all the time. So
truth. If you look at the wide receivers they picked up this year too, it's just atrocious.
They traded up for N'Keal Harry. Like I understand, Josh Gordon, and I kind of get Antonio Brown. But like N'Keal Harry, you traded up for him? Goodness.
So, if nothing else, the game looked different, and maybe this is kind of the reason why you rest your starters for week 17, or in the case of Cook, the few weeks prior to that. But this team looked fresh, and it looked speedy, with the exception of Thielen on that first fumble, where it almost looked like he was going half speed. This was a team that it really did look like it had fresh legs, and Cook looked good.
Yeah, he really did. And honestly, Thielen, I think, ended up showing out that he was pretty physically fine. But yeah, the team did look fresh. I think, the rest that they took against Chicago, maybe that's why Jaron Kearse didn't play. He got too tired against Chicago. I guess Sendejo played just as many. But yeah, I mean, the team I thought looked not just like fresh, but like focused, and so it was good to see a healthy and energetic team, and I think it actually may have showed up more at the offensive line than at the skill positions. I think you're right that like Cook had a lot of burst and acceleration, especially early on. He's ripping off like 11 yard, 7 yard, 8 yard runs. And he's doing it with a lot of great acceleration. But I thought the offensive line moved super well, especially in run blocking. Like even like Pat Elflein and Garrett Bradbury, who've been the worst performing offensive linemen all year, got into space and did a lot of work. Which, I mean, that's what they're known for, their athleticism and ability to move into space. But I think that it was pretty clear that the rest kind of helped them have the energy they needed to create just these massive holes, especially at the second level for Cook. So that was pretty big, yeah.
Yeah, Cook was all over the place, which leads me to a question about scheme, because it looked like the Vikings were having all sorts of success running right and a little bit up the middle, but anything left was just almost doomed from the start. And maybe this is just something that I noticed this game, but has this been something that's been happening all year?
So a lot of people had a lot of issues with the Vikings' ability to run to the left, which seems very appropriate for a team I cover. And by the end, the statistics do kind of bear it out. On runs off the left end or left tackle, they average -2.8 and -1.0 yards per carry. But the thing is, That doesn't include, I think, runs to the left that were charted as off the left guard. And you ended up with 2 7-yard runs, I think, in that situation. I was looking specifically at toss plays because I think people were pretty upset with them. And one of the biggest issues is they did have a 12-yard run off the left tackle on a left toss, but it was called back because of a penalty on Thielen that I don't think was the reason for the 12-yard gain. And it was kind of funny because I don't think that was a very good penalty. I don't think that was the correct call by the refs. Thielen knew he was going to get called for holding, and so he throws his hands up right away. That might have influenced their willingness to flag it in the first place. And because there were only 6 runs to the left, a 12-yard gain that was taken away does make it look, a lot worse than it was. And then you also have that negative 7-yard one late in the fourth quarter that affects these statistics a lot too. And Pat Elflein just doesn't get to his mark. He just gets blown up. And so, a free shot to Cook in the backfield. So you're almost as close as, adding that 12 and dropping that 7, dropping that negative 7. And now the Vikings have a great, yards per carry to the left. So I don't actually think that they played all that poorly running to the left. The problem is in the third quarter on toss play specifically, they had a 0-yard run to the left, a negative 7-yard run to the left that I mentioned. And then everyone kind of remembers the one in the overtime for negative 3. And that I think stuck in our minds a lot more than some of these more successful runs, because they started out their first run to the left, I think that was a toss anyway, was 7 yards. And I think their first run to the left, had decent gains too. So I think it seemed like they were running poorly to the left. And in the end, the statistics indicated that, but early on, they were doing all right running to the left and to the right. So I'm not that concerned about it. It turns out the Vikings did end up calling more plays running to the right by the end of the game. Some of those are, of course, receiver end runs, but some of those are just, running backs taking the ball running to the right. Dalvin Cook ends up with 6 off the left end and left tackle, and 2 off the left, or 5 off the left guard, and then I think 12 off of the right, plus 1 more that gets called back. So yeah, I think, they did end up changing and moving to the right a little bit over the course of the game. Running off the left wasn't great. I think a lot of that actually has to do more with the tight end, that happened to be blocking on that side than it does with the left tackle. I thought Riley Reif played all right, in run blocking. I think it happened to be the case that Kyle Rudolph, who had such a great game a couple weeks ago as a run blocker, he just happened to be lined up on the left. So I don't think there was a directional problem there for the Vikings. I just think, hey, Rudolph happened to be lined up on the left on that play, and he happened to allow that to happen. So I'm not that concerned about their directional play calling, because I think it has more to do with the tight end than the tackle. But it did hurt the Vikings pretty significantly.
So the big matchup that everyone was looking forward to, or dreading, depending on your fan base, was the Michael Thomas Xavier Rhodes matchup. And it turned out that Michael Thomas just wasn't all that much of a threat this game. I would have expected more of him and more of Latavius Murray.
Yeah, it's interesting because that's how you feel after the game, and it feels like he didn't have a huge impact. Then you look at the box score and he had 7 catches, and you're like, oh, that's a lot. Not a lot of people have 7 catches in a game. What's going on? Why does it feel like he didn't matter at all? And then you take a look, well, his long gain was 20 yards. That's pretty good, especially for him. He's an underneath receiver. So what happened? He only got 70 yards. He ended up with, I think, so that's exactly 10.0 yards per catch. He ended up with 1.86 yards per route run or something like that, 1.88 or 1.86. And over the course of a full season, that matches the impact that Devontae Parker had, who had an okay year, right? Good, not great, better than the average receiver, but probably worse than the average wide receiver 1. And that's the impact that he had in the game. They threw the ball a lot, and so it proportionally felt like he didn't have a lot, and so having 7 catches means a little bit less in that context than only getting 70 yards in those 7 catches with I think only 4 first downs on them. that's pretty significant. The Vikings did a pretty good job making sure that, even when he did get the ball, it wasn't all that meaningful. Harrison Smith, I think, tackled him short of the goal line on a second or third, or short of the first down marker on second or third down. You ended up with Anthony Barr. What's interesting is that Anthony Barr ends up in coverage on Michael Thomas 3 times. And every time that happens, you're like, man, why are they designing coverages? Or how is it that the Saints are designing offenses that put Anthony Barr one-on-one with the receiver? But the thing is, that's actually probably, it's not a good matchup, but it's probably a good situation, because the only instances in this game where Michael Thomas is lined up against Anthony Barr, matched up against Anthony Barr, is if he's playing short, because Barr is only playing short zones. And so when that occurs, when that mismatch happens, the Vikings have already won because Brees has decided not to push the ball down the field. And so in those instances, he doesn't average any better. There was one broken tackle, I think, that ends up going for 20 yards. And then he gets 11 yards in the other 2 receptions. So it was a net win for the Vikings when that happened. Xavier Rhodes ends up in coverage of him as the primary coverage receiver, a defensive back, on 3 of the targets. He had a really impressive pass deflection on one of them. The other 2 combined for 20 yards. So again, that's 10 yards of reception, long gain of 15, short gain of 5. And the short gain I thought was a really excellent play by Rhodes, because they did end up giving up underneath, which I think people have hated all year, but they were able to tackle and close. So not really an issue. Andrew Sandeo ended up with, what's interesting is that his pass deflection, I think, was not on Michael Thomas, but he only ends up with 1 target with Michael Thomas in coverage. It was like the first one of the game, and everyone was like, oh man, this is going to be a long day. And then he doesn't get targeted again. I think they contained Michael Thomas. I don't think this was a product of remarkable coverage. I think a lot of it just has to do with the excellence of the pass rush, but they were able to force Brees away from his first read, and his first read is Michael Thomas. So they were clearly, bracketing him, playing underneath. It wasn't just man, but they were able to employ like a variety of coverages that forced Brees to kind of look away. And when he looks away, he takes longer. When he takes longer, he invites pressure. So there was definitely a coverage element or a coverage aspect to it, where Rhodes was playing well. Harrison Smith was lined up against him once or twice, and he did all right there. Barr, I think, for all intents, I think he did okay. And then Sandeo did well. Which again, I think that's all very surprising. But yeah, Michael Thomas didn't have a huge impact. Again, I think a lot of that's the pass rush, but some of it's just the coverage was a lot better than I think a lot of people, including me, anticipated.
And then there's Alvin Kamara. And
who?
Exactly. The debate last episode with you and our guest was whether or not Alvin Kamara is actually dead. And
right, yeah.
He did score a touchdown, so let's give him some credit there. But Alvin Kamara was not a useful part of the New Orleans offense.
Yeah, his yards per reception, which I think his career is like 10, which is pretty good. That's Michael Thomas's for this game, right? That's really good for a running back. Quite good. Was 4.3 in this game, which sounds a lot like somebody's yards per carry. Of course, in this game, Alvin Kamara averaged 3 yards a carry. So he was still more efficient per touch receiving the ball, but it was just a really meaningless performance from him. So he ends up against Anthony Barr a number of times, 5 receptions for 5 targets with Anthony Barr in coverage, but never anything more than 9 yards. I think he gets 1 first down in those instances. Eric Kendricks dropped him for 6 yards behind the line of scrimmage. And another one was, I think, it wasn't a pass deflection. It was the interior pressure that forced Brees to kind of throw it in the dirt to Kamara. With Eric Kendricks in coverage. You had Harrison Smith once, Anthony Harris once. They both forced super short throws that didn't go very far. So, he just didn't do much. I think a lot of it was that the Saints couldn't figure out how to get the ball to him past the line of scrimmage, so they ended up throwing to him behind the line of scrimmage a lot. He actually had more yards after the catch than total, which is not rare for a running back, but I think for someone like Alvin Kamara, it's a little bit rare because he tends to get the ball, 3 or 4 yards downfield as opposed to -5 yards. That's a typical running back statistic, more yards after the catch than yards, but it's not, I think, a typical Alvin Kamara statistic. And so the Vikings were able to force Brees not to use his check down there. I know there was at least one instance late in the game where Alvin Kamara was the intended target on the screen pass, and Anthony Barr breaks off on his pass rush and just covers Kamara. He's got perfect coverage. Brees has to throw it away. So, which does not get logged as Anthony Barr in coverage by PFF, so it really should be 5 for 6. But he was me. And here I was thinking that the additional attention that they would give Michael Thomas would result in a huge day for Alvin Kamara and Jared Cook. And while Jared Cook did all right, it really did not mean anything for Alvin Kamara.
Not in the least. Though we can talk about the touchdown to Taysom Hill and how while Harrison Smith was really in a tough spot there. Because you were in a position where if this was going to be a drop off to Kamara, he was in the exact right spot. If it ended up being a toss to Taysom Hill, he was in a decent spot. He had to make a choice, and he ended up choosing the wrong one.
Yeah, so I think you're right that he ended up thinking it was probably going to be screen to Kamara, and I'm sure that he saw film that indicated that would be the case. And you're right that he guessed wrong. And it could just be the case that it's a read, right? That they key in on the defender on Hill and throw based on what the defender does. So no matter what Harrison Smith would do, he'd be wrong. Personally, kind of given the way the Vikings defense has kind of played all year with its emphasis on maybe overemphasis on stopping explosive plays, probably take that and go and just try to stop the bigger play from happening. Because you do have, I think it was Anthony Harris there, to provide support for Kamara, but you've got no support up top. So you should probably take the one up top. Just a misread by Harrison Smith. That was one of the bigger plays of the game. 20 yards, I think, was the total there. Pretty unfortunate. Yeah. It was a huge mistake by Harrison Smith. Smith ends up, I think, in this game not looking. I remember, so Brett Coleman, right before the game, tweeted at me that this really needs to be has a giant game for Harrison Smith. And it wasn't. He didn't have an awful game, but he certainly didn't have a good one. He gets burned in coverage a couple of times, usually in man coverage, and he makes the wrong decision there. It was not an ideal game for him. Anthony Harris had a better game than him, I think, fairly obviously. The pick helps. It's tough because, the Vikings just couldn't find a way to keep Taysom Hill contained. Which is such a weird sentence.
Well, you and I both agreed at one point that the biggest mistake that the Saints made was to take the ball out of Taysom Hill's hands. This was a game where Taysom Hill owned the Vikings.
Yeah, absolutely. It didn't matter, 50 yards over the top, 8 yards on the ground. So the Saints end up with 5.7 yards per carry in this game, and that is entirely due to Taysom Hill, who I think averaged 12.5. Because, like I said, they stopped Alvin Kamara, 3.0 yards per carry. Latavius Murray, I think, had 4.3 or 4.2 or something like that. It's entirely because of Taysom Hill, who was their most efficient rushing threat, and I guess it turns out their most efficient passer. Last year, the Taysom Hill package, which was crazy inefficient. It produced some pretty big plays, but for the most part, a lot of duds. And so it was easy to remember the big plays and easy to forget the duds and forget that all in balance, the Saints were worse off putting their backup utility guy in at quarterback versus the Hall of Famer, which is not a huge shock. This year, Taysom Hill and the package has been extraordinarily efficient, and the Vikings kind of saw why. He only has something like 15 pass attempts in his career, but 2 of them are against the Vikings, and they're both big completions. So they probably should have been prepared for it.
And we can talk about the bomb that burned Rhodes here, because this was, admittedly, do you see Taysom Hill in shotgun, you're still thinking that he's going to end up running it, and he was able to maneuver it in such a way, and Rhodes ended up just getting burned.
Yeah, Deontay Harris, the punt returner, lines up against Xavier Rhodes, and I think even kind of despite how Rhodes has played this year, even if you're one of the more pessimistic ones on Rhodes, you're probably thinking that's a mismatch, right? That's a mismatch in favor of the Vikings. And it turns out, I guess you're wrong. Deontay Harris ran a pretty good route. Rhodes engages in a speed turn, which is a classic Zimmer technique, but you turn as you anticipate where the receiver is going, and Harris is driving at the outside shoulder of Rhodes, and so that's the direction Rhodes goes. He cuts inside to the post. It's a deep down the middle of the field throw instead of a deep sideline throw, and Rhodes just gets cooked. And honestly, you do teach a lot of receivers to make moves while the cornerback is blind, or move into the cornerback's blind spot. And sometimes that just happens. Jarius Wright did it to Richard Sherman. Sometimes, great cornerbacks get burned by nobodies, right? I don't want to knock Jarius Wright too much, but I mean, Richard Sherman, right? Yeah, it just
Who was
happens.
apparently
Sometimes,
the smartest person to ever negotiate a contract ever, if you listen to Richard Sherman.
If you listen to Richard Sherman, yeah. Top cornerback in the league gets top 10. That's not a great contract then. No guarantees? Ooh, okay. Well, you bet on yourself. I really like Richard Sherman. It was such a mistake. Yeah. Deontay Harris, 50 yards, 48 in the air, 2 on the ground. It sucks. I mean, Rhodes played pretty well, all things considered, but it seems to happen. So against Seattle, it was a blown coverage. This wasn't a blown coverage. He just got hit he doesn't have any film on Deontay Harris. It happens sometimes, but it shouldn't happen this often. Otherwise, you would just throw in some random UDFA every game to get a big play. It's clearly you can't just excuse it because it doesn't happen every game to top corners where they're just well, he's never seen Damiere Byrd play. Come on down. It doesn't happen, right? So it shouldn't, but I understand kind of why it happens. So that was a pretty big play. And that ended up sucking. And then I think was it immediately after that they take Taysom Hill out?
Shortly thereafter, yeah.
All right, you did your job. What can you do in the red zone, guy?
Yeah. So before we talk about Anthony Harris's huge interception, I want to talk about Andrew Sendejo, who was put into a very interesting position. While sick for most of last week, he still ended up playing a position that he normally doesn't or has never played in the slot corner. And reports after the game suggested he was ridiculously exhausted and the last person to leave the locker room.
Yeah. Matthew Collar was the last reporter in the locker room, and he covered Andrew Sendejo being the last person to be in the locker room. He played, I think, every special team snap in addition to playing a bunch of nickel. Like you said, like Collar said, it must have just been an absolutely exhausting game for Sendejo. And this is kind of funny. So he was talking to Chris Thomason, which is just shocking because he doesn't talk to anybody. Chris Thomason, and I was right next to Thomason because I just thought this was going to be super funny. How is Sendejo just going to blow off this guy? And he asks, "Hey, so being in the nickel, how much did you practice that?" And he's like, "Well, I was sick all week, so I didn't." Super sarcastic, right? But he had the flu, so that checks out. He actually was listed as a full participant for Friday practice, so maybe that's not the case. But he said he wasn't practicing it all week, and to be fair, I think Friday practices are reserved for situational football, like 2-minute and stuff like that. And he says he didn't practice it all week. From my memory, he didn't do it ever in his career. I guess I can't speak to, what he did on the practice squad in Dallas or what he did in Philadelphia. But from my memory, he's never played in the nickel in the NFL, and he's, had a pretty long career at this point. And he doesn't practice all week. And then he said, what was it he said? He said something like, didn't play it all week. Saturday, get the call. Sunday, I ball. It's like, all right.
I mean, he's not wrong.
Yeah, you get that one.
Of all scenarios you could have mentioned to me before the game, you're like, oh yeah, by the way, Sendejo's going to be in the corner and going to be playing nickel all game. But he's like, why?
Right? Just like, they have a safety who plays nickel. What's going on here?
And I'm not calling it the best game of Sendejo's career by any stretch of the imagination, but that was a game that he showed up and was much. Sendejo's play tends to be one of those things where it's you take some good with bad. Like you end up getting the dumb penalty and you end up getting the interception. But this was a really solid game by Sendejo.
Yeah. So on Monday after the game, we ask, hey, so why? Like he didn't practice all week. He's never done it before. Why were you so confident in this matchup? Which, is secretly, it's a question about Jaron Kearse, but he's not going to answer if you mention Jaron Kearse. So he just says he's a smart guy, a lot of similarities between the two positions. We've had a lot of safeties play nickel in the past, which is true, but I don't know. Jaron Kearse did it well. Anton Exum did it well in camp. I guess, sure, but at least they did it in camp. Sendejo wasn't even here, and he didn't do it in camp when he was here. So I don't know. It was kind of fascinating. But yeah, like you said, he played really well.
Yeah, that was a nice surprise, a welcome one to be sure. And then Anthony Harris, who apparently only picks off tremendous quarterbacks with the huge interception.
Yeah, so if you take a look at the top 4 quarterbacks by interception rate, so they're who you'd expect: Aaron Rodgers, Patrick Mahomes, Drew Brees, Russell Wilson. If you get rid of all of the picks that Anthony Harris has against them, they all average 1% or fewer on their throws, which obviously doesn't affect Patrick Mahomes because he didn't play Mahomes, even though they almost had an opportunity to. That means that Anthony Harris himself accounts for 1 in every 6 picks that those 4 quarterbacks threw. And again, he didn't play one of them. If you only look at the 3 that he played, he accounts for 1 in every 4. That is tremendous. Holy crap. And that includes the postseason and the regular season, obviously. So yeah, good job, dude. He's really great at those kind of picks. And if it's more meaningful to, and he also picked off Matt Ryan twice, who 2.3% this year, so not quite as heavy, but he's under 2% if you get rid of the Anthony Harris pick. So yeah, he's done a really great job at figuring out kind of what these quarterbacks want to do. And admittedly, the pick against Russell Wilson, the defensive lineman batted that down and he just shows up. So it's not as if he was like, I'm playing 4-dimensional chess against Russell Wilson. But on the other hand, he actually should have a pick against Russell Wilson because he just drops one in cover 2 on a deep pass. So he was actually in position to get that other pick that I think they're both earned, but in different ways that mean different things. And to get that second pick that comes in pure coverage, would be even more. So yeah, I think it's fine to include the Russell Wilson one just because, he was in position to get that other one. Yeah, I don't know. That's pretty incredible. That obviously had a big impact on the game. So the Vikings, I think, I don't, one of these 2 turnovers that they have, they didn't turn into points. I think it was the Daniil Hunter one in the 4th quarter that they could have just iced the game. The Anthony Harris one, I think they did turn into points.
Yeah, that turned into a Cook touchdown that he was able to walk in.
Oh yeah, he just walked in. Yeah. Huge. It takes potentially 3, maybe 7 points off the board for the Saints. I just talked about how big turnovers are from a yardage perspective. And the reason, they're so big is because, not only do they suddenly get possession, which is worth a number of points? You lose possession, which is worth a number of points, which is why turnovers are worse than touchdowns are good, because you lose a scoring opportunity and then they get possession. Whereas with a touchdown, you convert a scoring opportunity and then they get possession. So there's 2 negatives for both of them. They get possession, but 1 positive and 1 negative. So it's basically 2-1 on that. So, that works in the Vikings' favor in this case, where, they took 3 to 7 points off the board for Brees. They add 7 points of their own. Huge swing. Again, if this doesn't happen, the Vikings probably lose in regulation. So, yeah, and what's interesting is that Anthony Harris's interceptions have all come in different situations. So, he is played as a deep cover 2 corner, gotten an interception on a deep pass. He is played as a man coverage player in the slot against a tight end, and he earned an interception in man coverage. He is played as a cover 4 corner, and he nailed the crosser on an adjustment. That was the Aaron Rodgers pick. He's played as a cover 1 corner, and he got the pick as the deep safety, and that's what happened in this Drew Brees one. So he's been able to play in a variety of ways and still been able to generate turnovers. I believe if you include, so if you include this and you only look at turnovers he's generated in games that he started over the past 2 years, and you only look at picks in any games that anybody has started in the past 2 years, he has more picks per game than Stephon Gilmore and Minkah Fitzpatrick, and every interception leader except Xavier Howard. And Xavier Howard is very boomer bust. He's like Marcus Peters or mid-career D'Angelo Hall, where he would give up a bunch of yards but make up for it with interceptions. Late career D'Angelo Hall just never made up for it. He had picks, but there's so many yards. Like Kevin King with the Packers this year. He has more picks per game, per start over the past 2 years than almost everybody else in the NFL. Like, name a guy, like, he has more picks than them except Xavier Howard. So, I don't know, really incredible. Shocking that he hasn't had, the postseason. I mean, not shocking because he's playing next to a Harrison Smith, but mildly disappointing that he doesn't get the postseason honors that I think he certainly deserves at this point.
So the Vikings were able to score, and then Deion Harris proceeds to return it to the Vikings 45, and Lutz misses the field goal.
Which means that return never happened. Why you bring it up?
I know, right? It's then they proceeded to spend the entire rest of the game kicking away from away from Harris as much as they could. So, yeah. We can go in the second half, and Xavier Rhodes is clearly hurt after his big stop, but still ends up making the play. Was this one of Rhodes' better games for the year? Was this his best game of the year?
Well, if you exclude the first game of the year, right? Because that's the one where they held Julio to 7 yards or whatever. Maybe that's an exaggeration. Julio didn't get very much in that game. A lot of that I thought was Rhodes playing well. Here's the thing. Sam Monson immediately after the game says this is not evidence that Rhodes actually played well. He played whatever. And Jones just didn't happen to get receptions. Which maybe that turns out to be a fair point given how the rest of the season went. I thought he played fairly well. Maybe I'm an idiot. But if you, I would say this is probably the best game that he's played. The thing is, the one against the Lions was a really good game, except the 2 receptions he does give up are in the end zone, to Marvin Jones both times. So if you evaluate each play independently, maybe the Lions game was better. But I mean, cause he still gives up the 50-yarder in this game, right? But if you look at kind of the impact his play had, this was probably the best game he's had, which is again upsetting because he gave up a 50-yarder. Pretty good though. Pretty good game, after making up for that big play. And it was like Taysom Hill, right? Like they expected a run. So, I don't want to make too many excuses that it's, you're supposed to defend on play action. Shocking. But it was, I think one of the better games that he's had this year. And I think you can make a really good case that it was his best.
Yeah. I was just happy to see that after his one play that, well, actually, you know what? I knew that he wasn't going to go to the sidelines. When he was kind of shaking his arm and holding his arm, I knew he wasn't going to do it because he had tackled him for a short gain or a loss. So it wasn't a big gain. He only goes to the sideline if he's hurt, if it's a big gain. That's kind of Rhodes' thing. But he still ends up making the big play. Diggs is beginning to be a bit of a distraction for at least the announcers. He was still technically on the field when he tossed his helmet. No penalty there, thankfully. But this was... Diggs, as you had said before, was open for a good chunk of the game. Was his behavior necessarily justified? You want Diggs to be happy, but you don't want him to be force-fed.
Yeah, so this is kind of interesting. Again, Sam Monson was like, why don't you just force feed him for a second? And then if it doesn't work, you just be like, well, it's not working. And if it does work, great, it worked. And of course, when he tweets that out, I think Diggs gets the 10-yard slant on in the fourth quarter, so, or in overtime even. It's interesting because he actually had a decent number of touches in the game, but, one's a pass, one's an end around. He ends up getting 6 yards on one. I think the other end around he gets like 0. He gets 2.
You get 2, yeah.
It totally had like 11 yards on receiver end arounds. Or reverses or what have you, plus the reverse pass. That's like 3 touches there, plus, like 3 or 4 targets. 3 targets, maybe. That's 6 targets. That's like not ideal, but it's not awful, especially in a game where you like Dalvin Cook has like 28 carries. So like 30 odd carries total or something like that, 32 maybe, by running backs. I think he was right. I don't know. The team seems to like genuinely not care. Like they don't give these, they're sort of canned answers, but they're not like the stressful canned answers. Like he's just passionate. It's our job as teammates to overcome any distraction or no, they're just like, oh yeah, he just like every game, whatever. Like it's very casual now when like reporters ask about it, like, hey, so Diggs was like yelling at like basically all of you and the coach, but especially Kirk. Are things all right? And they're like, was Diggs yelling? Oh yeah, I mean of course he was yelling. What are you talking about? And we're like, but he threw a helmet. Like that's not nothing. We're like, oh yeah, the helmet's fine. Don't worry about it. It's like that. We're not asking about the helmet. Like they just don't care. So it is a distraction for the announcers. I would argue that it is probably not as lackadaisically nothing as the team is kind of making it out to be, but it certainly is not that significant. I mean, like after the game, Zimmer was like, oh yeah, Diggs just like, he just says stuff, I guess. And you're like, yeah, I guess. And Zimmer's usually like he was like ticked off at Rhodes's blow up, right? I think against the Lions. He's like, yeah, that can never happen again, right? And he benched Rhodes, right? Whereas like Diggs is like potentially causing bodily harm to Kirk Cousins. And everyone's like, yeah, that character, whatever. At least it's not Percy.
we want passion and we want somebody who's going to play and not, without migraines or something. So we need Diggs out there. It'll be fine. Imagine if Diggs didn't let off that steam. Like, would he have killed somebody on the field? Like, he might have ripped off somebody's helmet and used it as a weapon against him. Like that was one hell of a toss. There was
he's going, man.
There was more energy spent in that throw than Kamara all game.
It's true. That's true. It was more energy in that throw than Drew Brees had all game.
Yeah.
He wasn't slinging it deep. I'll tell you that. But yeah, Diggs. He's passionate, and we asked him after the game, and which I mean, again, he was like lackadaisical too, and he was like, well, and he actually said something I found kind of not insightful, but like a great way. Well, I don't want to say he's uninsightful, but a great way of putting it. I would say for anything, people say if you don't show emotion, you don't care. But if you show too much emotion, you're a distraction. I wasn't frustrated about the coverage I was getting, which is fair because he was actually pretty open, I think, for most of the game. If you get multiple guys with eyes on you the whole game, that's just how it is. Don't ever get it confused. Don't confuse passion with distraction, because the guys on my team know me. We're always ready. We're going to do anything to get a win. People can formulate their own opinion, but I care about my teammates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So he's saying two things that are interesting, which is that there's a little bit of a double bind where if you show no emotion at all, you don't care. If you show any emotion now, it's too much and it's a distraction. I do think that's maybe a false double bind. I think that there's probably a pretty good middle ground. So here's an interesting question. Maybe Adam Thielen straddles the middle ground, or maybe he gets away with it.
Well, he gets away with it when the camera's not pointed at him, screaming at Kirk Cousins about Kirk Cousins trying to teach him how to run a route.
Right. Maybe that's a reason. I would argue that you're correct, that is one reason that the camera doesn't seem to find him in these situations. Which I think that's incidental. Like, the camera not finding him is like a product of the narrative that's been built up over for Diggs. So I'm not like insinuating that the cameras are like, oh. But yeah, there may be other reasons that the narrative hasn't been built up for Thielen in the first place, right? Despite shouting at refs, shouting at Belichick, shouting at Cousins. I mean, who did Cousins apologize to? Thielen. Sounds like Thielen's the distraction, right? I don't think either of them are the distraction. And I think between the two of them, genuinely, Diggs would be much more of a distraction. But it is like kind of fascinating, right? And it also helps that whenever Thielen's on, he's the one calming Diggs down. But I'm just saying, like, I wonder how passionate Thielen is during games.
I wonder if Thielen has in his extension.
I think it's because he shows up to games in Mauer jerseys. That's got to be the reason.
That might have something to do with it. I'm just envisioning Thielen having some stipulation in his contract, like number of times you console Diggs on the sideline, and whether or not he gets his bonus out of that, like $500,000 for doing it for averaging it 2 times a game. He's on as Diggs' support coach. He's really Diggs' support animal out there.
He's the emotional support receiver.
That works for me. So this was 20-10 going into the fourth, and I don't know about you, but I was the opposite of confident going into that. Just looking at staring at the clock the entirety of the fourth quarter. And then we have the overly eager fake punt, which was drawn up so well, and it looked like Taysom Hill was so excited to do it that they ended up snapping it at a time when not everyone was set. This would have screwed the Vikings. This would have been terrible.
Oh yeah, the Vikings would have been boned. I just watched it again on the All 22, the only way that you can ever watch games and not be blind. Because it's like 4th and 3, again, they only need to gain like 3 yards. So like, oh wow, Griffin does a great job getting into the backfield and tackling Taysom Hill. And it doesn't matter because the play's called dead, because of the false start. And man, Josh Hill was super excited. He just gets up and runs, right before the snap. The Saints are obviously pretty clearly nervous about this fake punt, which is, weird. Because, they do this a lot. Like they play these kind of games. He's really aggressive. I mean, I think one of the things that New Orleans is known for, they had like a famous surprise onside kick. It might have been in the Super Bowl against the Colts, right? Yeah, they do this stuff. So Hill should have been a lot calmer. The Vikings did get away with it. They clearly gained 3 yards. The point of attack is Stephen Weatherly, and he just gets blown right off the ball. And, maybe that's because of the false start, but actually Hill doesn't make a ton of contact with him. It's whoever number 53 is. So, yeah, the Vikings get away with it. The Saints would have extended a drive. And because of the tolerances that we're playing with here, the game ended in a tie. Any points, and they would basically be hitting midfield at that point. So they would only need like 15, maybe 20 yards to reasonably threaten a field goal. Any points, and now it's a loss for the Vikings, who obviously, if that happens, the Vikings play the last 5 minutes differently. But, if the Vikings could have been more efficient, they probably would have been. Maybe that's not true. Their late game fourth quarter play calling was not great. So, the Vikings get away with one. Pretty great return from Sherrills on that punt to set them up in better field position, which I believe they do not take advantage of at all. Oh boy, they got lucky.
Yeah, this was one of two situations that we'll talk about that the Vikings got very lucky because the Saints were being incredibly sloppy trying to get things off and fast. So the Vikings were able to kind of continue off, and all of a sudden Taysom Hill can't be tackled. We have the touchdown for the Saints, and things aren't looking good. Things are starting to fall apart, and we get the huge fumble caused by Danielle Hunter, the first of the year for Brees, and it cannot be overstated just how important that was.
Yeah, again, like you couldn't pick two bigger spots for Danielle Hunter to get the sack, and in particular, obviously, a fumble that like gives you the ball because it takes them out of the red zone, so they can't kick, right? So because they don't have the ball. I'm doing a real great job of explaining how football works.
TheAthletic.com, folks. Paywall.
The podcast is free.
I have this theory that Danielle Hunter on the wraparound ended up punching Drew Brees in like the funny bone area because you can clearly see his elbow like get punched on it, and the way he's shaking his hand and feeling his hand afterwards, it's entirely possible that ended up kind of happening there. Also, Drew Brees' elbow has been hit recently, right?
Yeah, it was a couple of games ago, maybe 2 weeks, maybe 1 week ago against the Panthers. He got hit, I think, in basically the same spot. Someone asked me, like, "Hey, do you think Danielle Hunter noticed that and looked to punch him in the right spot, kind of like a magic make him fumble button?" And I have a lot of regard for Danielle Hunter. I don't think that in those microseconds. He was like, I can't punch him there. I better punch him there.
There is no such thing as a hit stick while you're playing the game.
You're right.
This is not a thing.
And so I'm just like, that probably didn't happen. But you're right. He hit him in the funny bone, and it hurts a lot. When I swing my arm back and hit the armrest and hit my elbow, I'm out of commission for 5 minutes, right? Because I'm a wimp, right? I would have to imagine that Danielle Hunter punching it hurts maybe a little bit more.
I want to believe that he's paid to hurt more than your chair or armrest or something.
Well, I mean, the force is being generated by my elbow, and let's not undercut me here.
Any more than you just did a few minutes ago when we were plugging The Athletic, yeah.
Yeah, no, it was an enormous possession, and you really want the Vikings to close that one out. But regardless, right, it's the only reason that the Vikings are in a position where they've got the ability to win the game in overtime, or in a position to, win the game by playing in the fourth quarter. But yeah, just it was really incredible what Danielle Hunter was able to do. And again, it was not an interior rush. The interior rushes were maybe more important over the course of the game. But the sacks come on these exterior rushes or edge rushes. And what's interesting is that, we asked Hunter about this sack, and kind of what the thought process was. And the first thing he said is credit Linval Joseph. And I was thinking, I don't know that Joseph did anything. He actually played really well because he's one-on-one against, those guards that we were just taking a crap on. And so he's actually pushing the pocket a lot. So it's not like he did nothing, but off the top of my head, I was like, really? And he was saying credit Linval Joseph because he was saying the inside's open for you, the inside's open for you, the inside's open for you. And here's where the statement about choosing where the sack comes into play. Because that's basically what Danielle Hunter actually did, right? So one of the things that gets kind of, I think, under-discussed when we talk about pass rushers and pass blockers and kind of how the game works for them is that we often take individual plays in a vacuum, and say, hey, on this play he did this move, the tackle wasn't set properly, or the tackle had his arms in the wrong spot. And, that allows him to get this kind of space, and he gets into the backfield and he gets pressure. And that's important, right? You need to be technically sound as an edge rusher to be able to win against a tackle. But what's really important is asking questions like, why wasn't the tackle set properly? Maybe the answer is that they're bad, but in this case, it's not the case. Ryan Ramczyk has been quite good this year. Why are their arms in the wrong place or whatever, right? And the reason here is because Hunter's been rushing to the outside and he's been gaining depth all game. And so he's playing, and Jared Allen was really great at this. And Everson Griffin's good at it too, but Jared Allen was really phenomenal at this, where he would set up a move for the entire game, and then execute it to get the sack on third down or in the fourth quarter, or very often both in the fourth quarter and on third down. And so he get depth all game, and then here Danielle Hunter, he hops forward. And what's interesting is Armstead is so worried about gaining depth is that he almost false starts on this play. He just barely doesn't, but he jumps out to meet Hunter. And at the snap, there's about 1.5 feet of space between him and the guard. About half a second after the snap, and mind you, Hunter's on his second step at this point, there's 2 yards of space between him and the guard. Like, he jumps out to meet Hunter. And that's why Linval Joseph was telling Hunter, hey, there's space inside, go inside. And Hunter's like, I'm trying. I'm going to, just wait. I'm going to do it. And then that happens and he goes inside and, boom, sack, right? So really incredible stuff. And the thing is, he knows this is happening. He knows that Armstead's going to jump out because he's been jumping out for the entire fourth quarter. He knows Armstead's going to do that. And he still takes that step up field to hold him and force Armstead's arm out. And that, I think, is really important, because knowing that the inside is there is not as important as finding a way to effectively utilize it. So Armstead jumps out, creates a ton of space, and a lot of defensive ends will immediately buzz inside. And if that happens, the tackle has the ability to use your momentum against you. But Hunter hops upfield and gets Ramczyk to, maybe I've been saying Armstead the whole time, I don't know, gets Ramczyk to push his arm out, and in doing so, gives Hunter the space to get the leverage he needs to win on the inside. He swims over that arm, pins that arm to Ramczyk's body. Now Ramczyk can't push him out, and he gets the sack. Really great stuff.
So the Vikings weren't able to do a damn thing after that, sadly, but we were able to take some clock away. Positive. And then there was the Cook fumble. That wasn't.
Ish.
Yeah.
Right.
This seemed like, and maybe this was just, playing until the whistle, whatever, but there were a lot of defensive touchdowns taken away from the Saints due to either penalties or the calls being played, or calls being blown dead. I can think of at least 2. Possibly 3.
And I don't want to discount the Vikings, because holding the Saints to 20 points is really impressive, but it's very easy to watch the fourth quarter and say that this is a game the Saints lost, not the game that the Vikings won. I would say that given what happened in the first 3 quarters, you can say the Vikings earned the win, right? But by being superior, right? By playing better. But that fourth quarter was definitely the Vikings almost trying to lose and the Saints being too polite. And some of it's just hey, that fumble, that's not the Saints trying to lose. Obviously, they're trying to win. And it just gets called back. And I would argue that they're not necessarily unlucky. I think that it was not a 50-50 call. I think he's very clearly on the ground and stuff like that. But the fact that the fumble occurs at all, is because they're deciding to run the ball, on 1st and 10 again and again and again, in the fourth quarter. And here it's very clear the Vikings are going to run, toss left, which is what the people have been, kind of complaining about, in my mailbags. And they see it coming. The biggest issue with this fumble is not the play call, though. I know a lot of people were saying that, these left tosses aren't working, and honestly, the tosses were working, at least early in the game. The issue is that Elflein can't get to his spot in time. And that might be a product, I think, of a really well schemed defense because so the Saints have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 players at the line of scrimmage. That's wild, right? And the Vikings are in 22 personnel. Like they're not, or no, they're in 13 personnel. So they've only got one receiver on the field. It's Thielen. But it's 1st and 10. Like Thielen is lined up against a cornerback that does not have a safety over top because there's 3 players. You can see all 11 players in a really tight window on the screen. Like the broadcast footage and the all 22 is really zoomed in because you can see every player. So Thielen's up against Marshawn Lattimore, who, has been good this year. So it's not like it's necessarily an easy matchup. But the Vikings are running essentially to the strength of the Saints defense. And so Pat Elflein has to wrap around. Kyle Rudolph actually holds up his block. But he has to wrap around Kyle Rudolph and get to, who's number 53? AJ Klein. He has to get to AJ Klein, who's already at the line of scrimmage. And so this is just a losing play. Like Elflein screws this up. He doesn't play well here, but I would argue the bigger issue was that the blocking rules for this play didn't put him in a position to win. I think the odds are that, someone in his position is going to lose because he has to fold over. I think it's called a fold block where you've got, the place guard essentially pulling. It might have been better to have the blocking rules such that all the tight ends block down. And maybe that was what was supposed to happen. And Elflein kind of got screwed on the assignment here. Like it's sometimes difficult to tell. And then Elflein takes the kick out block against, the safety on the edge. And that might have been better. And that would have prevented Klein from getting where he needed to go. But yeah, I mean, Elflein gets totaled on this play. He's in a difficult position. The leverage is really poor. AJ Klein's already at the line of scrimmage, so he just has to run forward. Whereas Elflein has to turn a corner to get to him. Klein gets to Cook. It's like so obviously not a fumble too, cause like Cook falls to the ground and I think someone was saying, and I don't know if it was Cook, but someone was saying that Cook was falling awkwardly. So to protect himself, very often you kind of just let go of the ball, as like a almost conscious kind of thing because you're down. That one's kind of tough, but yeah, it's just a really difficult play call. And I think it's not so much the call as it is the execution of the blocking rules. And again, it might be that Tyler Conklin was blocking out instead of in. Like it might just be, the blocking rules went wrong there as opposed to the play call being wrong. But yeah, I mean, that was so huge. It ends up being a 7-yard loss. Obviously, if that wasn't to happen, it's very difficult to envision the Vikings winning the game. There's, 3 minutes left after that because it's 3:01 after the fumble return / after, as the Vikings line up on 2nd and 17. It's 3:01. It's a comeback situation. Cousins has come back before. We've seen it. Obviously in a score to win situation, he's scored and won. We saw that in the next quarter in overtime. It's very difficult to think of the Vikings as winning. Maybe their play calling changes once they're behind as a result of that touchdown. So it's not, it's not like we can expect the fourth quarter performance they've had thus far to be a replication of the fourth quarter performance that they're going to continue to have if they're behind. But it's a negative expected points scenario, whereas overtime is not. It's a positive expected points scenario. It's a positive win probability scenario if you win the coin flip. It's a negative win probability scenario if you have possession down 4. But yeah, Vikings kind of got lucky, but at the same time, Cook was like very obviously down. A lot of things went wrong there. I think another sin is that on 2nd and 17, they decided to run it. And not only that, -2 yards. And so the Vikings lose yardage there. It's 3rd and 19, and they lose yardage again on a sack that I was wrong at the time. He should have taken the sack instead of throwing it away because the Saints screwed up their clock management there. I tweeted out at the time that maybe don't take that sack, but it's 3rd and 19. It's difficult to convert. An arm punt is whatever to me at that point, except turnover, stop the clock too. So maybe he was correct to take the sack. but you lose 4 yards is the problem. So now they start that series, not the drive, but that series at the Minnesota 47. So basically at midfield. And now they're at the Minnesota 34 when they're punting. So, pretty obviously their own territory. And so if it wasn't for, I think just I think Britton Colquitt had just an excellent game overall. If it wasn't for what amounted to a decent punt that, was it Kentrell Brothers screwed that up? No, that Eric Wilson, should have been able to get the tackle on that he misses. The Saints would have been pinned at their own 15. Pretty decent punt. He had some pretty good punts throughout the game. The Vikings would have just been, if it wasn't for that, the Vikings would have been done because of the -7 yards they took, plus the play calling afterwards.
So we're now at the point of the game where I lost my mind, and I've watched this back at least 4 times now, possibly 5, and I still can't figure out what the hell Sean Payton was doing. So let's go over that final drive of the fourth quarter for the Saints, and I'm not saying talk me down from a ledge, I don't need that, but I'm still trying to figure out what exactly they were trying to accomplish by playing for the tie here, at a time when they had the Vikings so on their heels that the defenders weren't even getting set at the line.
So if the Saints call a timeout after the sack, so there's a lot of things here. If the Saints call a timeout after the sack, the Vikings punt on a stopped clock with 2:40 left. 2:40. They don't do that, so the Vikings, so the Saints get the ball with 1:55 left without the free timeout of the 2-minute warning to run a play. Mind-bogglingly bad clock management. They could have had 3 extra plays, and they don't do it.
Andy Reid mocks them.
Right, yeah. So this is why the sack was good. Because, Jesus, what are you doing? That's why. What are you doing? So yeah, they could have had 3 extra plays with the free timeout. They lose the free timeout is, I think, a big part of this. Because Deontay Harris returns the punt, and as a result of returning the punt, they go onto the other side of the 2-minute warning. So even if he chooses not to return the punt, and instead of a 10-yard return, it's a no return at all, they would have the ball at 2:05, and so they get 1 free play. But ignore that for now. They lose 3 plays and a timeout, essentially, or a free timeout, that would have been tremendous for them. But instead they get the ball with 1:55 left, and it's just a bunch of short passes. 6-yard pass to Alvin Kamara, where Anthony Barr does get it was a -4 yard, passing depth. So he gets 10 yards after the catch. And as Stephen Weatherly chases him down, I was kind of surprised that Weatherly was the one that was able to get it. After that, just a bunch of short passes. So Brees short pass to Jared Cook. Jared Cook actually does burn Harrison Smith. This is what I was talking about earlier. 8 yards. I think that stops the clock. And that's another thing about the Stephen Weatherly tackle about Alvin Kamara. It tackled him in bounds. So that was really good. That moves the clock from 1:55 to 1:31. The Jared Cook one, where he was able to get out of bounds, burning Harrison Smith on a route to the outside. That does stop the clock, so they're at 1:26. Then they pass again, short right to Alvin Kamara, Anthony Barr. Anthony Barr is in the wrong landmark there. So the Saints are taking advantage of small mistakes the Vikings are making, but they're not taking shots to try and win the game. Alvin Kamara gets tackled in bounds, 1:02 left on the clock, and they're still not past midfield. They just passed midfield. And it's just you could have had the ball with 2:40 left, and instead you just passed midfield at 1:02. AJ Wild, right? Short middle to Michael Thomas. What are you doing? Short right to Jared Cook, 14 yards. What are you doing? Spiking the ball at 21 seconds. First, I just hate spikes, first of all. But second, you're at the Minnesota 26 with 21 seconds left, and you're spiking the ball and in order to save time, and you can't even take the 1 second to get set. And so, false start, 5 yards, you get pushed back to the Minnesota 31. They just weren't trying to win. They were definitely trying to tie. They took a bunch of short passes. They were willing to take those passes over the middle. 3 of those passes end up draining time off the clock because they can't get out of bounds. They're not pushing the ball down the field.
We've complained about Vikings 2-minute offense this year.
Doing the exact thing. And the thing is,
we were looking in a mirror. This was amazing.
They did it against the Saints like last year with 9 minutes left on the clock, down 3 scores.
Yeah.
Like, what are you doing? It's the same thing. They're taking all these passes over the middle. And the thing is, they're winning on the outside and they're not focusing on those outside routes. And so they only stop the clock a couple of times. And then they spike the ball to stop the clock. When it takes almost as long to run a play, but if you false start, that's 10 seconds run off the clock. Now there's 11 seconds left. All right, quick throw, 7 seconds left. It's incomplete. Quick throw, 7 seconds left. You think 2nd and 15, 7 seconds left. Your last throw took 4 seconds, right? You'd think because you only need 1 second on the clock, plus you still have your timeout, you'd think, okay,
the timeout is key here. You have a Hall of Fame quarterback in Drew Brees. You have Taysom Hill, who has been eating the Vikings' lunch all day. You have the number 1 receiver in the league in Michael Thomas. I'm going to kick the field goal here.
Yeah, and the thing is, they kicked the field goal with so much time left that there's actually 2 seconds left at kickoff. Like, if the Vikings wanted to return, I mean, like Abdullah does attempt to return it, kind of. They did put 1 second on the clock, and then the Vikings kind of kneel it, which I would have liked a Hail Mary, but I guess they were worried about another fumble return for a touchdown or something.
At that point, just like, fine.
Yeah, it's either at the 25. You got to throw 75 yards in the air. I don't know if that Cousins has it, but yeah, I just, why would you leave time for the kickoff? Why wouldn't you take a shot at the end zone to win?
You had
playing
the Vikings,
for a tie.
You had the Vikings on
Terrible
their heels.
clock management.
This was the equivalent of the UFC fighter who takes it to the 5th round and kind of coasts it at the end and be like, oh, it'll be fine. I'm just going to let it go to the judges. And then it turns out he loses on 2 of the judges' scorecards, and he's sitting there just holding himself like, what do I do with my hands right now? I don't.
Right.
I have no idea what's happening. This was so. And if the Saints don't muddy this up, the Saints win. The Saints have every opportunity to win this. The Saints had plenty of time that they could have arranged this. And instead, Sean Payton, I don't know if you say got too cute or was just a plain idiot with the way that they ended up running the both the play calling and running the clock management. It was absurd at that point in time to go for the tie.
Yeah, I'm shocked at what they.
The fact that not more people are talking about the last drive of the Saints for this game is astonishing to me, because this is coaching 101. This is playing from behind, being in a position to win, and vomiting all over yourself. Like, I cannot handle this pressure. And you'd think a coach that tends to be as aggressive as Sean Payton has been would be better suited, would be well suited for this sort of situation.
I mean, he's been aggressive in the past, and he knows the capabilities of his offense, especially in no huddle. And I was kind of surprised there are no huddles. I mean, on plays that drain the clock were 23, 24 seconds. And, I don't know. I've seen no huddles operate faster, which, I mean, it's tough to get your tolerances so tight that you're at 13 seconds, but you probably could have had an extra play if you're running a tighter ship too.
It's not like their offense was super tired. If you look at the time of possession, the offense wasn't out there nearly as long as their defense. This wasn't a situation where the offense was dragging or something. You had, whether you believe in momentum or not, you were in charge of that situation, and that was all on you.
Yeah, no, that's the key point, is that you're in charge of the situation and you don't have the ability to kind of manage that clock. And again, they're not taking those throws to the outside. And again, they had 3 plays that they gave up. And again, they wasted a timeout that they had anyway. So you could have used that timeout. And because you don't get extra points for that timeout. Otherwise they would have won the game, right? You don't get credit for the timeout. So yeah, I can't, we were looking at Saints forums after the game because I wanted to see kind of what their perspective was on why they thought they lost. And, the comment section of Canal Street Chronicles and the game summary, a lot of it's just like, yeah, maybe that was OPI in the end zone against Rudy or whatever, but I mean, we don't deserve the win or whatever, which is kind of very like the opposite of that Rams game last year, right? Where they were so incensed that they, petitioned the NFL and stuff like that. Here, the call isn't obvious enough. Plus, nobody likes pass interference anyway. The Saints, just didn't play very well for most of the game. And so they were like, well, the Vikings outplayed us. They deserve to win. Would have been nice to get that call. This sucks, whatever. But there was very little discussion, like you said, about that fourth quarter management. And that fourth quarter management by Sean Payton was just extraordinarily bad.
That, yeah. So it goes to overtime, despite the fact that it clearly shouldn't have. And the Vikings win the toss, which I didn't think was allowed. But here we are. The Vikings won the toss in overtime and elect to receive. There are a couple of nice plays by Cook and Diggs to lead up to the toss. And then there is a bomb to Thielen, which looked vaguely familiar.
Yeah, it was I don't know, it was great. The last drive by the Vikings was efficient in a way that the fourth quarter was not, right? They ran the ball for not a ton, but they were able to get that third down to Diggs. Like you said, that bomb to Thielen. What's interesting is we asked after the game, like, hey, so Marshawn Lattimore was injured. He's out of the game. So Thielen is lined up against whoever. And, was that part of your progression? Did your eye snap to him? Did you call that play knowing that Lattimore was out? And, we don't get coordinators after the game. And so Zimmer was like, well, if they did, I don't know. I didn't even know Lattimore was out of the game. Maybe somebody in the booth told Stefanski, and Stefanski, called in that play knowing that Thielen was likely going to be the open one, but the play was not designed to Thielen. It was just, and like I said, Ted Wynn broke it down. It was just, that Thielen was the more open of the two on that play because Diggs, drew in the safety. The way Thielen caught that, it reminds me of the Packers game last year.
Beautiful basket catch. Catch.
Yeah, just incredible. Really good throw. Really phenomenal catch. We were kind of waiting for that throw all game, too. And honestly, in fairness, Cousins had that throw earlier in the game, but Hollins is 160 pounds and couldn't hold on to it. The thing, he caught it twice. If you watch the replay of Alexander Hollins on that deep throw in the seam, he catches it twice, and then he hits the ground and the ball flies out. You're like, yeah, that would have been amazing because that would have won the game, right? But instead, you have to wait for overtime. It was a beautiful throw, and it was enormous. And the way Thielen's body is contorted, like what the? And so I saw a couple of people being like, that's more about Adam Thielen's ball tracking than it is Kirk Cousins' throw. And like, if you evaluate the throw like in a vacuum, yeah, I guess it was off target and Thielen tracked the ball really well. But like the context here is that Kirk Cousins is getting drilled. Like he's snapping in half as he's throwing the ball. That's pretty good, all things considered.
As soon as he let it go, I saw him get hit. As soon as I saw him let it go, I was like, okay, this is going to be underthrown as a result of the hit, and this is going to end up being a pit. Oh my God, it wasn't. This is allowed?
Yeah, there were a bunch of people on TV. So we're in the stadium, so we can see the trajectory of the ball. There were a bunch of people who were watching. I saw the video. That I think the Vikings put out this video, and then a bunch of other people put out a bunch of other videos of people kind of reacting. It doesn't have quite the same emotional core of the Minneapolis Miracle, but it's pretty good. Of people reacting, and a lot of people are like, no, because they expected the pick. Like, you're right. Like, it was very easy to see him get drilled as he's throwing, and you're like, oh, that ball is in the air for a long time. He's probably underthrowing it. Oh, no. And like Thielen has like 3 yards of separation or whatever. And he catches it. In the stadium, we're just like, yeah, if this one flies off target, that would be nuts. And it didn't. So like, it was just like, Yeah, it was actually, so I see Cousins get nailed as it's happening, but my eyes immediately snap downfield. So I didn't really get a sense of how much he got pummeled on the play. And then I saw a replay, on like the tiny TV screen above me. The New Orleans press box is absurd. The tiny TV screen above me, and like Cousins dies essentially. Like, what is happening? And yeah, it was great. Incredible stuff. That wasn't even the last play of the game, but that really incredible.
So they try to run it. It doesn't work. They try to run it. It doesn't end up working. And then they do the Gronk play. Tight end, corner of the end zone on a corner that is at least a head shorter than Kyle Rudolph. And it was so obvious that even Troy Aikman went, hey, look at this. This is going to happen.
Yeah, he circles him, right?
Yep.
It was kind of funny. So I didn't know that at the time. I was distracted. But I was watching, like I said, that video. He circles Kyle Rudolph, and he's like, Kyle Rudolph to the left. And I was like, oh, good job, Troy. It turns out you were right. But in one of the videos, someone just like repeats it, like, oh, there's Kyle Rudolph. I'm like, yeah, what do you think, Troy's lying to you? Like, and I want to get, like, excuse him, like it's a tense moment. Like, you're not thinking, oh, am I repeating information that was just given to me? But it's 2 days later for me. I get to watch it after the fact. I no longer have like the tension. I'm just like, you're just repeating what he said, buddy. You don't get credit for this. Oh, there's Kyle Rudolph. Watch out for him.
This was such a fun game to rewatch after the game was over. Like, this was so much of a much better watch the second time than it was the first.
Oh, it's stomach turning. I'll talk about like the emotional impact of the game, but like I wanted to talk about this play for a second because so he's lined up against, I want to say, Marcus Williams, right? I think he's lined up against the safety. So the Vikings have a different play call in the huddle. It's a normal play call. I suspect it's a pick play of some sort. There's no reason for me to think that. They've been doing that a lot in the red zone. And they went away from it in the middle of the season.
Oh, it wouldn't have been Marcus Williams because Marcus Williams was on the sidelines.
Oh, he was? Oh, so it's PJ Williams.
Yeah.
Huh. Oh boy. That's worse. For them. At least PJ Williams is taller than Marcus Williams. He's got that. No, actually Marcus Williams is 6'1". No, PJ Williams is 6 feet even. Great. Yeah, so PJ Williams is lined up against him. So the Vikings have a play called in there. And again, I think it's a pick play, maybe a slant or something like that. But there's a check in the play. Essentially, if they blitz everybody, so if it's cover zero, they're going to throw a fade to Rudolph. Because here's the beauty of cover zero. You know exactly what the coverage is. It's man coverage with no safeties over the top. No one's double teamed. So Rudolph is necessarily one-on-one with whoever he's matched up with. And if it's cover zero, it's probably not a linebacker. It's almost certainly a defensive back. Very, very rarely are you going to leave a linebacker in coverage. So Rudolph is lined up against or I guess in this case a cornerback, and it's cover zero, and they throw it up, and he just towers over this dude, and he grabs it, and it's fine. So the fade in the end zone is typically, I want to say, a 30% play. I think that's what PFF said. That is a 30% play. But that's all fades, right? That's not like fades with double teams, fades in the corner of the end zone versus, there's a lot of space for Rudy there, right? Versus, the near middle of the end zone. It's not the middle of the end zone, but there's a lot of space, right? Versus like the amount of distance to the sideline and the back line. That plays a significant part because you can get bullied out at the catch on a fade, because you're trying to play the outside as opposed to the inside. So it doesn't take that into account. Then obviously it just doesn't account for the size mismatch. And so I'm really curious what the percentages are there. Typically one reason to throw the fade, and the fade has the lowest success rate of almost any play, even at the goal line. But the reason to throw the fade is that it is impossible to turn the ball over. I shouldn't say impossible, but it's very difficult to turn the ball over. Your negative plays are incompletions. But on third down at the goal line in overtime, it's not different, right? Like, it's not different between a turnover and, if the Vikings go for it, which I don't think they will on 4th and 3 because they lost or 4th and 4 maybe, because they lost a couple of yards on that run. I don't think the Vikings go for it. So I think that's a field goal, which is better than a turnover, right? Because then if the Saints kick a field goal, they don't win the game. But, it's the risk calculus is a lot different in this scenario because it's overtime where, if they get the ball and score a touchdown, they win. So the turnover thing is just not as important for the calculation of the fade. But that's one big reason that you throw the fade is because it's very difficult to get turned over there. But you don't tend to complete those passes very often. Slants over the middle, even though it's super crowded and there's a really high pick percentage on slants in the goal line, are much more likely to turn into touchdowns for you. So, that makes it kind of interesting. The thing is, if the Vikings wanted to run a quick play, a pick play or slant or something like that, or another type of play, it would develop kind of slowly. And that's another reason to throw a fade against cover zero, because you're just not going to have time in the pocket. You just simply can't afford the time for any route to develop. The good thing about this fade is that Rudy just has to get somewhere and then turn around. Like, there's no, I need to match my footwork so I can pick this guy off. There's no, I need to adjust my slant so that there's a hole in coverage. None of that. I'm taking 4 steps and turning around. And if this guy who's like 50 pounds lighter than me wants to stop me, he can try. He's going to get called for pass interference, which will be hilarious. It doesn't matter. I'll catch the ball. So that's the other part of this is that you call the fade here, or the fade is a check here because there's not enough time. So I saw some criticism of the fact that it was very muted criticism because everyone was like, well, it worked. So I can't disregard it too much, but they're like, oh, run, fade. They're the most old school. They're so lucky it worked out. And it's like, well, first of all, running at the goal line is actually a pretty positive percentage play. The problem is that second run was an outside toss where, again, the tosses were working more than they weren't in this game. I know it feels like they were failing, but for the most part, they were working. But it's the goal line. I don't care. Like, if you were tossing at 100% success rate, I would consider it. But if your tosses are like 60% and you're averaging just a little bit over your normal yards per carry and it's the goal line, I don't care. -3 yards is worth a lot more at that point in the game. So I would probably run it up the middle. But runs are efficient at the goal line. Or even if you're not going to run it up the middle, you snap out a shotgun and you can RPO, right? Where if the linebacker draws in, you throw the slant. If he doesn't, you can still run to the outside, but it's a very quick handoff so that the back gets the ball quickly and they can cut back or whatever, right? But I'm not tossing. So that's the problem. But run, fade, I think sounds a lot worse than it actually was. Because there's a lot of really positive considerations for what the Vikings did, or arguments in their favor. And yeah, obviously it worked out. So you can't, again, be too vociferous in your criticism. Just like I can't be like, well, Adam Thielen was a net negative. I don't know.
Yes, please just don't be like Arif in this situation.
I didn't send the tweet. That's remarkable restraint from me.
That is actually, you would have
grade me on a curve.
To quote Riverton from the officials, we looked at all of the angles that Fox afforded us, and Fox gave us some great views. There is contact by both players, but none of that contact rises to the level of a foul. This is consistent with what we've done all year, and we left the ruling on the field. We let it stand. Can we just put this to bed? Because if unless you're blind, or you're just looking at the final second of that catch, there was hand fighting by both of them the entire play.
So I do want to kind of put it to bed because in my eyes, it's not a great offensive pass interference call. But what I find kind of interesting is that a lot of people, so like Mike Pereira, Tony Carneni, Dean Blandino, John Perry, a lot of the officiating analysts that were former officials, they all basically said it was OPI. So I'm interested in that because it didn't strike me as OPI. And then again, you and I, we both went through a lot of these comments, and a lot of Saints fans were like, it was OPI, but it doesn't matter. We should have lost. But a lot of them were just like, it's maybe it's not OPI. Maybe it's too close to call. And, they've got kind of a vested interest in being mad about the outcome of the game. And so I find it kind of interesting that the officials were like, we should call that as OPI. The thing is, Mike Pereira makes an interesting point, and I think most of the officials were essentially saying this. Oh, and Football Zebras, which is a really great resource, I think, for explaining officiating and stuff like that, because they do, I think, a really great job without necessarily being attached to the league. And they had a live blog of the wildcard game, and they also said it was OPI. So to me, I agree with you, James. It doesn't seem like OPI to me. PJ Williams initiates contact, and that hand fighting continues throughout the process of the play, and then Rudolph goes up and gets it, and Williams wasn't even complaining about OPI, right? But the key, apparently, according to Perry and I think Pereira, or at least according to at least two people, is that one of the keys here is we have an indicator, which is that Williams's head was jerked back, and I'm pretty sure he's not acting because he wasn't complaining about OPI after the play. Like, if you're acting, you'd go in, right? And so at that point, you're like, well, okay, so it is a full extension. Contact seems to occur. Mostly occurs in stills and slow motion. It doesn't seem to occur in real time to me anyway. And Rudolph comes down with it. But the key, I think, the second key is that Pereira and I think one other official also say that doesn't mean it raises to the level of a review overturning it. And Pereira's biggest problem with Riveron's statement is the phrase does not rise to the level of a foul. And it should be something more along the lines of does not rise to the level of overturning the call on the field instead. Because it would need to be more obvious. So in that case, yeah, I guess you could say the Vikings got lucky there. The Vikings probably got lucky on Dalvin Cook's second touchdown. And I don't think the Vikings got lucky on the fumble return touchdown though, because he was just down, right? And the reason he lets go of the ball is because he is down. There's other plays, right, where the Vikings got unlucky. There should have been a false start on the Thielen fumble, which I think that was pointed out by the blog. That would have been a huge swing, right? I think there's another play that didn't go. So it's not like the Saints were so aggrieved by the officiating. Plus, I mean, the Dalvin Cook one, you could very easily argue it one way or the other. So, the real response here is to defend that a little bit better. So, it's not like the Saints got in an unbalanced number of calls going against them. But, that OPI is the one that stands out. I don't think there's going to be too many talkers about it just because Saints fans are just not that ticked off about it because they watched their offense struggle for 3 quarters. And so it's very difficult to say that they probably earned a win there. And it seems to be the feeling after the game.
Yeah. So that is it for the Saints game. And we will save most of the wild card weekend reaction for next episode. But I did want to get in with some breaking news that the New York Giants are finalizing a deal to make Patriots wide receiver coach Joe Judge their next head coach.
Yeah, I am a little interested / confused about this.
Wow. I don't, that's, I mean, I can only judge him off the whole, like, what have you done for me lately? I can look at the receivers that how well the receivers did this year, and I don't know if it was more of the receivers having problems or Brady having problems, but that's not the first guy I would have gone with.
Yeah. I mean, their special teams were good, so maybe there's that.
If you listen to the broadcast this weekend, anybody who was anybody started as a special teams coach. So that's clearly what you should do to hire your coaches.
See, here's the thing. It's confusing, but like there's no evidence that how good you are at your prior coaching job is a good indication of how good you'll be one level up or down. So I'm confused. It doesn't make it a bad move. It's just interesting because then you have to ask, what did they see in him? And, maybe he kills the interview and maybe, you're really impressed with his like ability to kind of fuse analytics and coaching. Maybe you're really impressed with the organizational chart that he's built out. Maybe you're really impressed with the types of coaches that he feels he can hire. Maybe, he kills the interview and the interview is so good that you want to hire him. The real question is how he got the interview. So that's what's confusing to me. And again, the Patriots special teams were pretty good this year. Maybe that was part of it. And I really like the idea of going out of the box and hiring special teams coordinators. I think Dave Tube should have been a head coach or should be a head coach, at some point. So I'm fascinated, but I can't say that this is necessarily a bad move because, when Mike McCarthy was hired by Green Bay, and I think the Packers were right to fire him, but I also think the Packers were right to hire him. He was just coming off a season where he led like the 30th best offense in the league by points. So like, who cares, right? Like it was just so weird that they hired him. And then, he develops these quarterbacks, Aaron Rodgers becomes a great quarterback and is part of, McCarthy's quarterback school is like one of the things that he did. And then, they win a Super Bowl. Like, they were ahead of the curve in terms of coaching for a good chunk of time. And then he just kind of got stuck in his ways. Right. And we'll see kind of how that turns out in Dallas. But, that was a good hire. And again, and he was not good at his prior job. We've seen a lot of really great coordinators turn into really poor coaches. I mean, we'll kind of see what Vic Fangio does. I would say despite the Dolphins record, Brian Flores, who is not a coordinator, has been doing, I think, a respectable job and enough to say that he might be a good coach. We can't tell until the Dolphins front office like tries to get players, instead of like the 76ers or whatever. But like, that Brian Flores might pan out, right? Whereas like Adam Gase, who was a coordinator of a record-breaking offense, technically, has just been an awful coach. So maybe I kind of appreciate out of the box thinking. I'm just so confused. Like, why? What's the reasoning? Not even necessarily what the reasoning for hiring him is, but what the reasoning for interviewing him. And like, why was he on your radar?
To quote Drew McGarry's tweet, never forget how deeply the Giants need to consistently underwhelm their own fans.
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it. Who knows if the hire is good or bad, but like I can't imagine like being jazzed about this.
And the Giants have asked to interview Jason Garrett for their offensive coordinator position. Because sure.
Wait, really?
Yes.
That's not a joke?
Nope. That's a Schefter.
But that's bad, though. That's objectively bad. That's not. Who knows what this guy could do? Head coaching is weird. Jason Garrett has been the offensive coordinator for a long time. The offense blew up because Kellen Moore took over. Like, we have like a without metric for this guy. Yeah. What the hell?
I'm just walking away, just not going to cover it. We appreciate you guys sticking around with us. This episode has gone ridiculously long. We're going to go to the mailbag here and knock some of this out. Tyler Braun asks, I believe it should be Luke Braun, actually. I don't know why I put Tyler there. Luke Braun asks, what player's performance was the biggest surprise? Vikings and Saints, good or bad?
Sendejo, good. He's an up and down safety. I just wouldn't have expected him to play very well as a man coverage corner. So it's not even like I think that Sendejo is a fine safety and he's been underrated his final couple years with the Vikings. So I don't want to like crap on him too much, but like I don't think anyone saw that coming. That was really impressive. So that's what I'd say. Surprise positive, surprise negative from the Vikings. Well, Adam Thielen to start, right? Obviously finished out. Defensively, it's pretty good defense. I can't say. Oh, Harrison Smith. I thought he would have played better than he did. But very limited in terms of negative liability. Saints, positive. Yeah, I expected Taysom Hill to do some damage. I was still surprised at the amount that he did. Obviously, the Deontay Harris deep throw slash catch. So Harris will count as another surprise positive for the Saints, but Taysom Hill overall would be the surprise negative. Drew Brees, I expected him to like dice them up, and he didn't.
Next question is from Bill Bodke, who says, everyone is tired of the narrative that Mike Zimmer might get fired if he lost the New Orleans game, but I want to pursue it a little longer. Given the rumors were from credible people in the national media, it suggests that ownership decided to spread them. While everyone likes Kevin Stefanski, Mike Zimmer is a successful, well-respected coach whose players like him and play hard for him. Why would management want to make a change? Are the Wilfs that upset about a lack of playoff wins, or is there something deeper here?
So I think the line of reasoning here is it makes sense, right? Like I think it totally makes sense. I will say though, the fact that the Wilfs rushed out a statement when it doesn't make sense to rush out a statement tells me that the initial reports were not leaked by them. Because like, why would you, so there's some evidence here that it didn't go through PR. I don't know that. Like, I can't say that, but it wasn't emailed out to Vikings reporters, which is what happens every time it goes out through PR. It was sent to Pro Football Talk direct. I assume in an email sent to Pro Football Talk directly, which tells me that the Wilfs just sent it. And if the Wilfs just sent it, that means that this is probably what they actually think, that they don't buy that, or they don't agree with the rumors that Zimmer is on the hot seat. So it might be other people in the organization reading into the tea leaves that ended up not being there, or it could be Jerry Jones being like, hey, I've got a clue that maybe the Wilfs are not that enamored with Zimmer. And if they're not that enamored with Zimmer, I know an owner who's willing to trade for him. Me, Jerry Jones, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys. But yeah, I think that all makes sense, but I don't think that that's what happened. I do think that the owners, and here's the thing. I've mentioned this a couple of times on the show. And I talked about this because we're talking about the Zimmer thing before the game against the Saints because we're like, how much do we buy this, right? I was talking with somebody else about this, and I was like, so my take is that the Wilfs are obsessed with being the Maras of the Roonies. They're obsessed with being stable, and that they don't want to like lose coaches and stuff like that. And I've said this a couple of times, and I've said it so many times that I wanted to check myself, right? I wanted to say, am I inventing this, or did I actually perceive that correctly either by hearing about it or observing it or whatever? Like, cause I don't even remember where I came up with that take. And so I was checking it with another reporter, and he was like, oh, absolutely, 100%. Absolutely. It's an obsession for them. So, no, I don't think this was leaked by ownership. And I think if he was truly on the hot seat, ownership probably wouldn't be the ones leaking it. It would probably be, somebody else within the organization. And this happens a lot, owners are not that tight-lipped when they're like talking to their rich friends that are not NFL owners, and sometimes they'll just tell people stuff. So that might be part of it too. I don't think the Wilfs leaked that Zimmer was actually on the hot seat.
Ryan Jellerson asks an important question that we all really should consider. Should we consider the possibility that Sean Payton sold his soul in 2009, 2010, and now he's just paying his dues?
Yeah, there's no evidence to suggest that you're wrong about this.
I think that's the best possible answer to that. Anton asks, how do you feel about the following scenario? The Vikings do not re-sign Everson for cap reasons, but make Odenigbo the starter.
It's tough after a game where Everson has 2 sacks. Yeah, he was falling off at the end of the year. I think Odenigbo has all the potential in the world. I can chalk this up as a win for me. I'm glad. I'm always glad when my takes are right. Sorry. I don't know why you listen to this podcast. I'm so narcissistic. But my take, before the season was that Odenigbo was better than Weatherly and should be the primary backup. And, if one of them emerges as the starter to be, would be Odenigbo. I would say, it makes sense to, it's so much cap pressure. It makes sense to, unfortunately, let go of Everson Griffin just because that late season drop off. I don't think you get to make up for it with what he did in that game unless he continues to perform in the playoffs, and then you're in a much more difficult position. But I would say it makes sense to let go of Everson Griffin and then have a competition between Odenigbo and like a 3rd or 4th round pick. I wouldn't say Odenigbo has been so good, and I know he's gotten 7.5 or 7 sacks or something like that, has been as a rotational guy, which is impressive, right? That's Daniil stuff, right? But I would say that from a film perspective, he hasn't been so overwhelming that you'd say, hey, he's the starter. But I would say he's earned a shot to earn that role, and he might be the better even medium-term or even short-term solution at end versus Griffin, which it just sucks to say because I love Everson so much. But I don't think he's played so well that you can say, hey, we're not going to put a super athlete to compete for the spot here. And I don't think Weatherly is at a spot where he can be that competition. I think he's a fine rotational backup. He's playing a little bit better this year than I expected. But he's not, I don't think, in the same caliber right now as Odenigbo is.
Next question is from Kenneth Allen, who asks, is a victory over Sean Payton more satisfying than any other coach? Seeing his stupid Zoolander face pucker his lips in disappointment is just too good.
I think about this question. I'm just like, I don't really have vendettas against coaches. But then I'm thinking about the time he did the Skull chant right before the Minneapolis Miracle at Vikings fans, and it's like, what coaches do that? Like, what do you? Come on.
Not that I hold Belichick to like the highest standard of all, but you certainly wouldn't see Belichick doing it. I can't think of a single coach in the league that would do it, with the possible exception of John Gruden. But I don't know if his arms reach that high. I don't think I've ever seen him move.
Well, when they get up that high, they just naturally cross. So
that's a damn shame when that happens. Stephen A. Smith asks, and not that Stephen A. Smith, do you think Brees licking his fingers on average 10,000 times a game had an effect on him losing the fumble?
Here's the thing. I could never be, or maybe I shouldn't say I could never be, but it's difficult for me to imagine being a professional quarterback if I had the talent and the size and all that, right? So let's assume I'm 6'4", 250, actually fit, and I'm a pretty decent quarterback. Let's say I'm Joey Harrington, right? Like, I don't have to be good. I can't imagine lining up every play, just your hand in someone's butt sweat crack, and then licking your hands. That's the thing that gets me.
That's probably why you don't see Kirk Cousins doing it all the time. Maybe Drew Brees, maybe the center for the Saints doesn't have that problem. Kirk Cousins lives in a completely different world.
They all have that problem. It's just Bradbury's is worse, apparently. They all have the problem. You can't not sweat. It's like either or, right? Like, football fields are dirty, and if you're in shotgun the whole time, I would still probably, like, if I've got a habit of like licking my fingers, whatever, I'd probably still do it. If I'm in shotgun the whole time. But even though the football fields are dirty, but if I'm lining up under center like more than twice, I'm not forgetting about that. And they've done it literally thousands of times, so it's nothing to them. So maybe in the experience, you're just like, yeah, whatever, Arif, get over it. But yeah, I definitely have like a bottle of Purell on the sideline. But yeah, that has nothing to do with your question. Not that your question was crazy serious. But he hasn't, like, James, didn't you mention he hasn't, like, fumbled all season or something?
It was the only fumble he had all year.
Yeah, so, maybe not. Maybe there's nothing to do with it. Maybe it gives him additional grip.
It gives him powers. Vikings All Day asks, hey, can you guys find out what the win percentage is of teams that for the next game after walking off winners in the playoffs?
I'm not doing that again. I don't remember what it was last. I think Luke Braun did it last year and was like, this is not going to go well. And then he was right. Or somebody did it and they were like, I don't know about that.
It's
but
low.
I would imagine.
Let's just go with it's low.
It's not over 500. But I would say that that's probably not applicable in this case, just because the Vikings just experienced that 2 years ago. And so whatever kind of like emotional high or distraction or focus problems that come from it, you're probably not going to be subject to it because almost the entire team is the same. The part that's not Kirk Cousins doesn't like have emotions, so you don't have to worry about that. It's a problem. I think if the Vikings lose, unless they get blown out like 45-0, which is certainly in the cards. But if they lose, I think it's just because, hey, San Francisco had a bye, the Vikings had a short week, and also San Francisco's probably the better team. So like, there's a bunch of factors that are working against the Vikings here. I would say the walk-off win thing is probably not that big.
HVAC Repairman asks, how torn was Arif when his favorite team took out his favorite player in the late game?
I don't... Look, the Orlando Apollos didn't even play last week.
Oh, I thought you were going to go with James Madison Dukes, and you went straight out with that.
I've been harassing the Banner Society Twitter, the SB Nation site that runs their college football blog, because they haven't written once about the James Madison Dukes, and they're headed into the national championship. My Dukes are so disrespected.
True,
you see that?
Obviously.
You see Hero Sports, which covers everything but FBS football. They cover FCS, Division 2, Division 3, even NAIA, and they've got like all NAIA teams. Like they're deep in the weeds on this stuff. They asked a bunch of FCS coaches who's going to win the national championship game. And wouldn't you know it, 80% of them picked NDSU.
Mm-hmm. Clearly
My Dukes
biased.
get no love. The only people who picked the Dukes are in the same division as the Dukes. It would only make them look better if they picked the Dukes anyway, if the Dukes won. Like, come on, people not in the NDSU or the Dukes' conference, they almost all picked NDSU. I can't believe it. He's rookie freshman quarterback.
We'll have much more to say on the Dukes next episode when
Duke's Code.
Yeah, of Duke's Code, exactly. Logan says, 5 friends and I made a pact to run the Twin Cities Marathon if the Vikings win the Super Bowl. None of us are marathon runners, and I am the only runner. Will James, Dusty, and Arif make the same pact? No. Next question. Dusty's run a 5 or a 10K before, but I will bike 26.4 miles or whatever, but I'm not, or 26.2. I'm not running.
I just found out the past couple of weeks, I might be willing to walk that far. Thank you, New York. Thank you, New Orleans. Turns out I am willing to walk.
Yeah. Don from Ohio asks, what's the best recipe to use for Saints tears?
Man, did you know that butterflies drink alligator tears?
I did not know that.
Yeah. So probably, what would relate to that? Probably something like honey.
Probably fried like, butterfly. Is that where?
No,
what the hell were they cooking down there?
Yeah, right. No, I would probably say, along those lines, probably make like a nice honey tea out of it.
I was just thinking about the idea of like trapping it, boiling it off, and just using the salt in regular applications. It's simple.
Well, so what you'd want to do here is you boil it off and then rub that salt in their wounds.
Oh.
Yeah.
Can you toss it at them? Like you would be tossing shade? Like, I'm not stopping here. I'm just walking by and throwing your own salt back at you. Also, live PD comes to your region, and James and Arif are pulled over by the local police. James is obviously driving because Arif can't reach the gas pedal to drive. My questions are, what do they pull you over for? What do they search the car for? And what is Arif hiding in the child seat?
Hiding in the child seat?
I assume that he believes that you are sitting in the booster seat.
Right, but like, I know, I assume that's what he's assuming, but like,
there are compartments usually, like cup holders and things in the in children's seats.
Yeah, as somebody who gives parenting advice on a podcast, I know that, James. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to let you know that, just in case you had forgotten.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, fair enough. But like,
with all of your kids,
the reason for my confusion was just because I wouldn't imagine anyone would be so immoral as to use the innocence of a child to hide their crimes. I'm hiding the All-22 in the booster seat.
Makes sense.
Well, I forgot the other parts of this question. There's an elaborate setup. What
do they pull us over for? Because we're driving in Minnesota, there's always the suspicion of texting. So they probably pull us over for that possibility, or because I drive in North Dakota and Minnesota, and in North Dakota you don't have to go to the far left lane when there's a cop pulled over on the highway. So I might get popped for that. I have gotten popped for that before.
You get popped for nearly clipping a trooper?
Yeah, even though it was so dumb. He yelled at me too when I got pulled over. Like, what the hell were you doing? It was like, you were even going too fast. I was like, I was driving 10 miles under the speed limit and I couldn't go because there was another guy in the left lane. Sorry, I was really annoyed at that ticket. It's one of those things.
Did you contest it?
I wanted to, but my laziness was way higher than and it was only like a $25 ticket. It's like, fine.
Oh yeah, okay.
That's not worth me taking time off of work to deal with this.
Probably losing money that way.
It was very different from the time that I was from a different situation when I was harassed by somebody who thought I was drunk, and yeah, it was all sorts of fun. Driving home from work and dealing with some psycho chasing me in my car. That's a story for a different podcast or a different live show. But what were they pulled over for? Suspicion of texting. What did they search the car for? I'm gonna say dead bodies because of your son. Yeah, because of my son, obviously, right. and because of what my wife does. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah,
and Arif is clearly hiding the All-22, the good All-22 view.
Yeah, the good All-22
from the Bears Stadium. That's exactly what you're hiding. There.
That's great.
That works for me. All right. Thank you guys so much for listening to this long edition, this extended edition of Norse Code. We'll be back to preview the 49ers matchup here in just a day or two. So hope you guys enjoy that. Arif, let's plug that awesome article you wrote.
That's over at theathletic.com. It is about a little bit about actually also the atmosphere of the game, which we didn't get into in the super long podcast because it was super long. But also about just some of the key moments and the key players of the game. I'm really happy with it. I'm really proud of it. Check it out.
Indeed. So thank you guys so much for listening. We will be back later this week for the 49ers matchup. But for Arif, my name is James. Thank you guys so much for sticking around and really going back to Norse Code at its roots for a nearly 2.5 hour episode. So thank you guys so much. And please remember that revenge is a dish best served funky as hell, and apparently in New Orleans. So please remember that, and we will see you guys later this week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, and he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and co-host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can make your one-time donation at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can also be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.